So it's a pleasure to be here. I'll give you a bit of my background, I guess, and why I'm presenting this topic as opposed to regular coral reef biology. But my background is as a coral biologist. I studied at the University of Miami. I did my PhD there. Though I'm from Kenya and I live in Kenya now. And after finishing my PhD, I moved back here. And so I focused a lot on coral ecology, coral bleaching dynamics. I started working in Kenya in 1997, so just before the global bleaching event in 1998. And because I had worked on coral stress resistance for my PhD, I went straight into looking at how corals dealt with the bleaching event with thermal stress. And then towards larger scales throughout East Africa, looking at reef impacts from the bleaching event through the CORDIO project that started in 1999, and then looking at reef recovery. And then over time, I've become very interested in reef resilience and recovery processes, and then of course looking at fishermen, community dependence on coral reefs, and then also at larger scales like the regional scale of reef dynamics, recovery and resilience processes. So now, I guess this is almost 23, 24 years later, I'm with all of the growing impacts of coral reefs. They're really a flagship system globally for the state of the planet, I think, for climate change, for resource use, for growing impacts, and also for the sorts of actions we have to take to reduce impacts, not just to coral reefs, but to coastal ecosystems, to the ocean as a whole, and also to all planetary systems, so terrestrial systems as well. So I'm really focused on coral reefs as a learning ecosystem because they show us very starkly what is happening. And they're one of the first ecosystems to be disappearing with climate change impacts. So we have to learn quickly in order to save coral reefs, but we also have to learn quickly in order to minimize impacts to other systems and impacts to people as well. So I'm focused a lot on the Sustainable Development Goals now. And I think the framing that they give is a very powerful one for talking about the actions we need to take. Our understanding of coral reef ecosystem dynamics, but also of human dependence on reefs and their vulnerability to that dependence. And resource extraction is very important and very instructive. So I'll focus on that in this talk, but of course, if you have questions more on the biological side and the ecological side afterwards, I'm very happy to discuss that too. So the presentation I'll do now, I'll start with describing basically the contents of this publication that I realized in August or September at the end of last year. I'm not sure how much you all are involved in policy issues around the Convention on Biological Diversity. But I've been involved in the post-2020 discussions around the new targets, the new framework for the convention, which was to be decided this year, but is postponed till next year. But I realized that there's a lot of general discussion about what needs to be done, but it's very hard to link the local actions and needs and priorities to national and global priorities and discussions. So I wrote this paper to help with that process. So I'll go through that with a coral reef example, and hopefully it should relate to many of the issues you're facing in Brazil as well. And I was lucky enough to come to Brazil a few years ago and see the Abrolhos Islands. So there's certainly a lot of parallels in the pressures affecting our reefs. So this paper is about the Sustainable Development Goals as a narrative or as a model for understanding ecosystem health and our impacts to it. The goals themselves, I think this kind of figure is very accessible and known to many people. It's very square and rectangular. It doesn't really explain the interactions and what lies behind these goals and how they link to each other. There have been some studies looking at this, particularly this one is from about 3 years ago, looking at how goal 14 in particular, which is about the oceans and life below water. So that's in a sense the main goal we look at when we're thinking about coral reefs, how goal 14 on the left there has linkages across to other goals and how strong those linkages are and those interactions. And this bar chart illustrates how with SDG 14, there are some targets under SDG 11, 12, and 13 that have positive interactions in blue, and those can be weak, which are scaled as 1, or very strong positive interactions, up to 3. Or there can be negative interactions, so in red and going below down to -3. So for example, SDG 11 is about sustainable communities and cities, and you can either develop those communities and cities with positive interactions with the ocean or with negative interactions. So it's possible to decide what to do. But it's very complicated looking at these interactions one by one, and many of these targets are not necessarily very applicable to the local situation. They're based on national policies or national indicators. So it's been very hard for provinces or districts or towns or even protected areas to see themselves in the Sustainable Development Goals. So what I tried to do with this model is to, rather than look at the interactions between the goals, is to look at the whole system of the goals through one goal, in this case, SDG 14. So what we do as biologists, of course, we go diving, we collect data on reefs, and this is what we see. And so the idea with this model and this paper is, rather than looking at the goals as a dry system, is how does the whole system look like if you dive into it, as we do on a reef, and you start to look from goal 14 on oceans, so the reefs, to the other goals. And in this model, I built them into these, grouped them into these tiers. So there are 17 different sustainable development goals, and they have very strong interactions and strong relationships with each other, which are built into the goals, but I took it from the perspective of a reef to try and explore that. So just to explain this in a bit more detail. So taking goal 14 at the bottom, I realized you could build a story or a narrative around including all of the 17 goals and explain a coral reef situation. So in this case, the health and status of coral reefs, so goal 14, is described by measures of coral and fish diversity and abundance, generate ecosystem services. And this is what we study as biologists and ecologists, but there's much more to it. Because these services are moderated, and the health of the reef is moderated by land and seascape processes, so land use change and runoff, and these are goals 6 and 15, and climate change for goal 15. These services support jobs and economy, that's the focus of goal 8, coastal communities and cities, goal 11, extraction and use, goal 12, infrastructure and innovation, and energy solutions. And these contribute to reduced hunger and poverty, improved health, goal 3, strengthen gender and social equality, goal 10. But this doesn't happen in a vacuum. You need to have governance mechanisms and institutions, which is under goal 16, stakeholder investment and participation, and all this informed by overall awareness, education levels, and the technical knowledge that we have. And what I realized in putting this story together is that you can, if you ignore all the brackets, which we use as scientists to cite all of our, texts and our sources, you can actually write the SDG narrative in common language that's accessible and understandable to anybody. And I think that's really useful because we can use the SDGs as a theory of change for explaining what needs to be done. Now, in this paper, I decided to broaden that more from the level of, so initially focused on blue economy. And so obviously the ocean, land, fresh water, and the climate or weather, these are all aspects of natural capital or the environment. And this is what generates the ecosystem services that we use. These services are the things that support direct benefits or economy from nature, whether it's food, housing, shelter, drugs, energy. All these things are direct benefits from nature and describe the economic pillar of sustainable development. And of course, these direct benefits generate indirect benefits of reduced poverty and hunger, improved health, and so on. So you can really group the goals according to the 3 pillars of sustainable development. That's no surprise, that's what they're for. But then also the 4th set, which is related to the means of implementation. And the critical thing with this is that when we talk about sustainable development, or conventions make plans like the CBD or the Convention on Biological Diversity, we often focus just on the technical elements in the other 3 capitals, so natural, economy, and society. But the means of implementation, or the money and the decision-making and the knowledge that's needed are put somewhere else. And often countries forget or don't get around to investing as much as they need to in these things. But this really, I called it initially a blue economy narrative, but it's really the sustainable development narrative, but focused on the ocean, or looking at it through Goal 14. So what does this look like at the local level? And this is where I think our science can really contribute to these discussions. So if you look at fisheries, what we traditionally do is look at the direct benefit of fishing. So that's, we measure fish catch, and this would be under Goal 12 on sustainable response, on consumption and production. We want it to be sustainable. We also look at how that is obtained from the sea, and we can look at reef health and ecosystem health as well. We measure corals and algae, fish in coral studies. You can also look at the jobs, the number of fishermen, their income, and the valuation of this system. And this tends to be as far as it goes when we're managing fisheries. But you can also look at the broader sustainable development narrative around the system. So looking at, you can measure the indirect benefits, and many social and economic studies do this. You can look at food and nutrition under Goal 2. You can look at health benefits under Goal 3, look at poverty. And there's other indirect benefits as well, about how income is shared amongst society or between countries in Goal 10, between genders in Goal 5, and then also look at population issues. You also can look at how the system is affected by climate, runoff and nutrients, and coastal land use change, which are these environment and enabling factors. And you can also look at the means of implementation. So knowledge and education, governance and management, and then also funding. So essentially, what this model does is it helps us to build the story around what we need to do around managing a coral reef system sustainably, linked to all the sustainable development goals. And I think that's really important, because it enables us to then link what we do at the local scale to national scale reporting and to global scales under the United Nations and so on. But there's many other ways you can use the goals as well. So between the local and the international, there are multiple levels. So you can also look at national agendas. So I've got the narrative model on the right, and in Kenya, an example that we have is that our government has identified four main pillars for national development for the next 5 or 6 years. They call it the Big Four agenda. And so that's food and nutrition security, universal health, manufacturing, and affordable housing. And of course, you can package these into individual goals, so 2, 3, 8, and 11, as I show here. And when you look at a coral reef, you can actually see at the local level, so how would a local government deliver on this national agenda, looking at benefits from coral reefs? And so in this case, you could look at fisheries and sustainable production and consumption for food and nutrition. For universal health, you can look at nutrition as well, and increasing wealth. People have money to spend on healthcare. In manufacturing, you can look at how you invest in fisheries in terms of manufacturing in coastal cities and in natural products. And then, of course, increasing wealth enables people to afford housing. And then there's investment funds under goals 16 and 17 from well-managed that could invest in this process. So it's really, all of this is founded in an ecosystem approach to any of these sectors, all coherent around a coral reef and its ecology and vulnerabilities. And it enables you to take a holistic view and to organize very different sectors, which are traditionally very hard to put together. You can also look at a regional approach between countries. So I won't spend much time on this, but across countries, it's very hard to align policies because one country is focused on growth and manufacturing, another country is focused on, say, ecotourism and development, perhaps. And you can't force countries to have the same objectives or policies, but you can align policies and the sectors around the Sustainable Development Goals because all the countries have basically adopted them. You can also look at links among the SDGs and indicators for assessing progress across all of them. You can build on existing national measurement and reporting systems to integrate data from different sectors in a coherent model. You can look at overlap and complementarity between countries' priorities, and then dependencies and interactions, and upstream, downstream effects. And then with all the different conventions and commitments that countries have, each of those conventions relates to a different component that the SDGs focus on. So for example, the Convention on Biological Diversity is about natural capital at the bottom, and there are, say, the WHO on health is focused on Goal 3. So you can link different commitments that countries have and assess them together. And I'll just come sort of to a priority that a lot of us are working on now, and perhaps some of you, in terms of the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Global Biodiversity Framework that's being negotiated right now. And I was looking at the discussions that different countries were having, and this was a proposal that the Brazilian delegation came up with that I thought was very useful because I'm quite visual and I like this sort of pyramid structure. And it helps to identify how you deal with the complexity at the bottom of the pyramid between all the different drivers of decline, the Agenda 2030, all sorts of things, but 3 objectives of the convention in the middle on conservation, sustainable use, and access and benefit sharing, well, aggregating up to this vision at the top. But I thought with this model provides a way to really use this kind of a pyramid structure in a way to explain, or like a theory of change to help identify what needs to be done. So for us in oceans or coral reefs, if the goal at the top, the 2050 vision, is to have a healthy, vibrant ocean, so that's goal 14 at the top. Under conservation, that deals with nature, so those natural, the natural pillar of the SDGs. Sustainable use is very much around economic activities that use various aspects of nature. So that middle tier of the model. Then access and benefit sharing is really about the indirect benefits at the top, and the means of implementation are also part of this model too. And through many discussions at the moment, there's a current update to what is called the zero draft of this Global Biodiversity Framework right now, released on the 17th of August. And it has 4 goals in the end. So goal A is on nature and relates to the arm on the left. Goal B is on nature's contributions to people. So it's really, it uses this framework of NCPs, nature's contributions to people, from the IPBES process. There are 18 of these classes of contributions. And it's really about using them sustainably. So the direct extraction from nature and how those benefits are shared amongst people. So it cuts across these 2 areas on the right. It's a bit complicated because there's also goal C, which is on equitable sharing, which is that element on the right. But because of historical reasons, the CBD is focused on genetic resources for goal C. But in reality, we now realize that equitable sharing needs to be applied to all of natural assets, so not just to genetic resources, but to species and ecosystem functions as well. And then there's a 4th goal has been brought into the framework, which focuses just on the means of implementation. So it really matches the 4 main parts of this model, which to me is very interesting because I developed the model because I felt that there wasn't clarity or consistent discussion about the main elements, the framework needed, and building on the existing framework, coming to a similar conclusions. So how do we use this? I'll just finish with this example now. And while I've come from very much a biological example, working in coral reefs in the Indian Ocean, now as part of this Convention on Biological Diversity post-2020 process, I've got involved with, there's an Africa Civil Society Organizations Alliance that has come together because of this process. So it started in January, February this year. And the idea was to try and speak to, because the African countries discuss and vote as a bloc under the CBD, to try and get a community and civil society voice to these African negotiators, rather than just going through national processes, and of course doing that as well. And so under this CSO group, we've found that this SDG model really does help to focus the recommendations and the ways to approach this broad set of goals under the CBD. So the group had identified that sustainable use is really the focus of African priorities under the CBD. In the past, the countries, particularly from the global north or Western countries, have focused on goal A, which is conservation of biodiversity. But goal B on sustainable use has had much less attention, and Africa really wants to push this. Now, the justification for their approach is that the challenge for biodiversity conservation, sustainable use, and benefits going to the people that really need them is that the challenges, the actors and potential actions are so many, while decline in natural assets and people's welfare is accelerating. But fortunately, there is a universally accepted theory of change, the Sustainable Development Goals, that we can use. And the reason it's useful for this is that it recognizes the value of economic assets, which of course our economies do, but it also recognizes the value of environmental assets and social assets as three co-equal components. And so the essence of this approach that we're taking up is to contextualize the SDGs to each set of actors in a particular land or seascape. So if you're trying to motivate for action in a country or in a town or a province or something like that, you have to convince not just the government, but also all of the businesses, the communities, the hotels and things like that to act sustainably. And how do they do that? So you need to bring the SDGs down to their scale. So what we've done is I illustrated this model with just fleshing it out some more as an SDG model for a coral reef fishing community on the coast of Kenya. And in doing this, sort of build up the story in a way that's more accessible to people for communicating our knowledge about what happens. So in this case, we have a couple, Hamisi and Mariam. He's a fisher. She sells his fish in the market and she keeps some of the fish for household use. And of course, their joint income pays for their school fees, for the medicine they need and all that. So their lives cross all of these SDGs that I've noted there. But all of this is dependent on the local reef system called Nkwiro. But it's used by a lot of fishermen. There's local tourism, the pressure is high, and fish are becoming depleted. And in Kenya, we have these beach management units, or BMUs, which are really a co-management agency that the government has put in place. So because of the capacity issues, the government has enabled the community fisher groups to have responsibility for local management, and so they manage together. There's a gender component because these 30% in all official institutions in Kenya, 30% must be women, 30% or more must be women. These beach management units can designate protected areas, and of course, because it's around local fisheries, they're most interested in how that can enhance their fish stocks and protect the fish, but it can also support tourism. Just this gender component, for example, Mariam's mother is an elder in the community, and she's been on the BMU committee for many years, and this particular year she's been chairing it, which is the case in several BMUs now in Kenya. And you can see the different SDGs are building up through this narrative about a coral reef area. The tourism development in the area is quite fast. So the town, the urban area is growing. There are impacts on fresh water and land use. There are local tourism operators and many other stakeholders that are very dependent on the reef and impact the reef in various ways. And so goal 17. But the entire economic system in this area does depend on a healthy sea. Another family component, so that Mariam and Hamisi's son went to college. He was the first of their family to be educated formally, and now he's working as an electrician. But because he's building up some income, he starts a cold store business with his family to market fish to hotels and restaurants. All of this is very vulnerable to climate change, of course, and because so the Paris Agreement and the ability of countries to slow down climate change will affect the health of this system greatly. But of course, the tourism in the area is very dependent on travel. So this system does have its own climate footprint that is important. And of course, all of this is governed through different levels of government, from local to national, establishing the regulations among interest groups and so on. And then importantly, in the middle is the equity, how all the benefits from this system are shared amongst different income groups in this area, as well as internationally with global tourism and travel, the gender aspects of the sharing, and of course this depends a lot on governance institutions in the middle. So there's a complex web here, but it's perfectly understandable once you describe it and build it out. But then I think the power here for the conventional biological diversity process is linking which elements of this model relate to which part of the convention or the new Global Biodiversity Framework. So goal A on conservation of biodiversity really just deals with the reef system itself. It's very focused on that, and that's what we have tended to focus on as ecologists. But when you look at goal B, which is on sustainable use, there are many different components of this area that depend on the reef. So there's the fishing, the tourism development, and all the other operators and businesses depend on sustainable use of that ecosystem. And then when you look at benefit sharing and equity, of course, that's in the middle over here. And in looking at how to build get the best results or have the most impact in Africa in our local context, we've seen that focusing on goal A, just on conservation, hasn't worked. Focusing on goal C, on equity, is very complicated because of all the different social relationships and governance relationships. All these red arrows relate to goal C. But perhaps goal B, focusing on the use of resources from nature and the sustainability of that use, provides a very direct mechanisms between nature and benefits to people, and the benefits people get and share. And so focusing on goal B and sustainable use we're pushing as really the fastest way to achieve success, the most direct way to achieve sustainability that we'd like to get. So just finishing with this, and the importance of the SDG process in this respect, as well as that it provides a window for, you can come at this problem from any direction. So from the CBD, we look at our viewpoint is from the oceans. We look at the natural system. There's also land and freshwater systems are involved from this perspective. But then in this coral reef seascape in the middle over here, the CBD goal B looks at sustainable use in goal 12, but also these other goals that I mentioned earlier. And then CBD goal C looks at equity and sharing, and the various indirect benefits as well. Now, the sustainable use perspective enables a focus on the tangible materials from nature that are consumed and non-consumed benefits, and the benefits to people, both direct and indirect. And the focus is on sustaining the material, sustaining the former, and optimizing and sharing the latter. So this SDG model allows addressing all stakeholder interests under the condition that they don't harm any other goal. And the importance here also is that, and what I've done here is, because we're focused on the CBD, I've put all the different global institutions related to each of the goals, but you could do it from a local perspective as well in terms of local government. But if you take on board the Sustainable Development Goals, you can come at this problem from any of these directions. One that's particularly important right now, of course, with the COVID pandemic, is the One Health approach and WHO as a lead institution. But the thing is, if you really take on this model of the SDGs, if you come at a local area or a problematic from a One Health perspective, or you come at it from a biodiversity perspective, your approaches may not be exactly the same, but they should at least be complementary, and they would probably be very synergistic. Whereas if you do it from sectoral basis, you can have very strong conflicts among them. So from that perspective, we're really focusing on this sustainable use model as really the focus or the way to achieve the CBD goals and Vision 2050, which is on living in harmony with nature. So that's the end of my presentation. I'll just finish with this slide that has the graphical abstract from this paper. And I'd be very interested in thoughts and questions. And I hope it connects directly with some of the work that some of you are doing. So thank you.
Thanks, David, for your excellent presentation. Now I open one space for discussion and maybe question the people. The people doing the question directly for David, or maybe you can write in Portuguese and try to traduce for David your questions.
Hi, David, and hi, Juan. Can I pose my question?
Yeah, maybe you can put your video is more.
Yeah, that would be nice.
Yeah.
Okay, but that's because my connection is bad. So
Okay.
I'm saying, and then I'll open my video. Okay.
Okay.
Otherwise, it can. Oh, thank you so much, David, for your presentation. I really enjoy your paper, and just to really recognize that your narrative model is something very important. And just to share that there's something that I really started studying during my stay here at the University of São Paulo at the Institute of Advanced Studies. I had a project, especially looking at this, and while I was working with fishing communities here in Brazil. And now all UN agencies need to look at these kind of SDGs, and because of that, many scholars are arguing that it may become a somehow empty keyword, like a worn out in some cases, because everyone is applying and saying that they are, in accordance to SDGs. And so my question is, what is your experience or knowledge on the implementation of this model in coral reef conservation? Like, can you say, like, if equity, or where could you illuminate us on where the equity issue is really being taken into consideration? I mean, any particular example of that on that? And thanks so much.
Yeah, sure. Do you want me to answer right away, Juan Pablo, or take a couple of questions?
No, come on, you can speak. Yeah, you can.
See you now, Mary. Yeah,
hello.
Thanks for that question. So, yeah, so at the moment, this has been essentially a conceptual model, a thought model, and I haven't moved forward yet. We're trying to develop some projects right now to develop indicators. So for all of these different goals that make sense in the local context, and much of this has already been done in socioeconomic work. So if you're looking at health, what are some of the standard health indicators like maternal and child mortality or infectious diseases? So we're trying to build up a system that makes sense. So we're starting on that, and would love to see how this compares to work you might be doing, or see if the model is useful for you in classifying some indicators and grouping them to see what are indirect benefits that you can identify where things are going well in coral reef areas. So we haven't done the primary work on it, but I think there are good examples around the world where there is good governance, where conservation is being done in tandem with health interventions as well. There are groups doing that in Madagascar, particularly, where you have elections and good governance in these community fishery organizations. So I think there are examples, and what I hope this model could do also is help organize the information from studies, so we can have more comparable studies from different places to really understand what are the conditions that really do push towards a sustainable, or really, an outcome that is compatible with the SDGs, or one that is not compatible with the SDGs. So maybe you may have some examples from Brazil that you could, that would be able to express this.
Yes, I mean, my question is that even in the CDB, the equity issue is not really very well covered.
No.
And so this is why I really look forward to have some examples of implementation of the equity issue in terms of coral reefs conservation. We have some, but not really explicitly considering equity, as an explicit part of governance. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
People, you have more questions? This goes for David. The people is very nervous in this moment. I have one question about your presentation. Is, in your opinion, how does the freeze step to research this quality, for example, in country in development? Because you have several social differences in different countries. It's very complicated. You try to mediate this difference. How is, in your opinion, is the first freeze step for research thesis?
The first step for doing this research?
Yeah.
But I think the first step, so what the SDG framework does is it's very inclusive. I mean, it includes, all the countries came together and they decided that these 17 are first order principles, in a way, basic rights or human rights, equivalent to that. So I think the key thing is to go to the sectors in there. So if we're developing a study and we want to look at health benefits, or how equitable is access to good healthcare, and is that affected by a healthy reef system that generates income, then we should go to that sector and find out what indicators they're using and start to use those. Because also then that the work that we do at the local level does correspond to sort of sectoral work in that sector, where health professionals are looking at around equity of healthcare and things like that. So I think it's really important to establish a sort of a joint working groups or task forces to try and populate this model with data that is relevant at the local level, or you can do it at a provincial level, or you could do it at a national level with national level indicators. But it's important, I think, to use tangible indicators that are already used in those different sectors, because then you can show those sectors how what they are doing is affecting another sector, and that the benefits that each and others get by aligning those and not damaging somebody else's. The key thing is to show, if you take each goal as having a capital, like natural capital is 1 under goal 14, we have to maintain that capital or build it rather than degrade it. So it's the same for any of the other goals, like health. You want to build the capital in health. You don't want to degrade health. And you can measure it that way using their indicators.
Thanks, David, for sharing your opinion. People, more question for David? Or... Okay. David. Yeah, please speak.
No, I was going to say, I mean, I'm not an expert in these sectors because this is really going into sustainability studies, I guess, and into socioeconomic fields, which is not where I come from. But having, when you work on coral reefs, you see how much local dependence there is, and also how quickly our systems are degrading. And if we don't act quickly, not only do we lose the system that we love, but the livelihoods and the benefits that people get will be lost, very quickly, and the consequences will be huge for many. So I'm really pushing from my biological side into doing this sort of work because of the urgency of the situation, not because I'm an expert in it.
David, you have one question in the chat. You can read, or
okay.
It's the Carla Pavoni. David, congratulations for your work. Always doing the conservation goal research stakeholders, especially on the sea personnel gains local environment preservation of the social equality. Do you think this is more effective in some case?
Yeah. So I think the issue about, so you have stakeholders, say a business, maybe they're, I don't know, it's a cafe or it's a shop selling something. They don't see personal gain in the local environment. They don't care or think they care about social equity and so on. But I think the value of this kind of model shows that and it very much applies to the current economic paradigm, which is, growth, make money, make more money, make money quickly. The more you do that, the better off you are. But for people to see the consequences, if you focus just on that comes with you undermine natural health or those aspects. You also undermine social equality and equity. And the consequence of those things declining is that you have to spend more money on, air conditioning or purifying your water or getting your food from further away because it can't be produced locally or because the natural system is declining. Or because there's very high social inequality, you have to pay more for security, for guards and stuff like that. You're more vulnerable to theft. So there are direct costs of just focusing on increasing your economic capital, but not paying attention to natural and social capital. So the idea is that this is a rule set that if everybody bought into, if you know that everyone is agreeing to that and is trying to do what they can, not undermine another capital, then perhaps you can accept earning a bit less money because you know that the non-monetary benefits you get from a natural, healthy system and the non-monetary benefits you get from social equity and equality and a good social system are very valuable in non-monetary ways. So it's really trying to take the focus away from money, which is, essentially is a measure under goal number 8. So out of these 17 goals, money is a primary measure of goal 8, only one of them. So if you equalize, the weight of income with the weight of good health and the weight of a healthy environment, I think you can make a very powerful case for people seeing the benefits of a good local environment and of social equity and so on. But of course, everybody has to buy into the system because if one person cheats, it hurts other people and the investments that they make.
Thanks, David. Another questions? Maybe I have time for the last question for David.
Yeah, well, can I make a question, Juan?
Yes, Oscar, please.
Yeah.
See me? I'm trying to put my video on. I'm not sure if it's let me see if I can do this. Yeah, well, okay. All right, David, I've got a question. So I know more or less your area. I mean, the Mombasa area, also in Eastern Africa. I can see like Kenyaka in Mozambique and so on. I'm just wondering how can you pick up like particular actions that make people really aware that well-being and making a clever use of resources really pay off what what we could say like short-term economic benefits, you know. So this is something that I see here in Brazil as well, and in other developing countries, that sometimes it's very compelling, making a fast use of resources and making money really fast, and not really thinking on the long run, and that your well-being is more dependent on how cleverly and how parsimoniously you use resources. So I would like to hear from you of any particular actions in this direction that you think might be working on your area and in Kenya, say.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think in Kenya we have a bit of a similar situation to Brazil, where we are, compared to other countries in our region, you know, we have quite a strong, very active economic system, and so the capitalist approach in really making money and building economic capitals is really a strong focus for many people. And the reason is because the governance systems don't really protect the individual. So if you want to look after your family, you do that by making money. So you can afford hospitals, and you can afford security, and you can afford all these different things. So to be honest, I think the most important thing to make this work is that the system works, and that's governance. So we really need governance systems to work in the interests of people, and so democratic processes and so on. And then with that, you can have good education awareness. You can have good case studies where people see a community taking good decisions and protecting its reef or mangroves, and benefits increasing, you know, in 5 or 6 or 7 years. So people can see that if they do take some actions, it's not easy. You might have to give up a few things for a short while, but long term, you have a much better and healthier system. So of course, I think you need education, and you need a lot of examples of what works in each of the different goals, for example. And we're working, of course, on healthy reefs and ecosystems. But you need to have good governance. You need to have a system that holds people accountable for doing the wrong thing, for degrading another capital, or, you know, degrading the environment. I think that's essential.
Thank you, David. And what is the tendency? You see some way of getting really better, or you see that it's really challenging? So what is your hope for the future? Let's say not in the world, but let's focus on your area at the very least.
Well, so I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball, and I'm neither a pessimist, or I wouldn't do this work, and I'm not a hopeless optimist either. But I'm a realist, and I think that, you know, given carbon dioxide emissions and all the other things that we're doing, we have to work towards the best possible outcome. So if we can use this model, if it can be expanded, and we show that it helps and works, then we will have a better outcome than by just not doing it. So I'm just trying to, you know, it's like, what's the fate of coral reefs? I think we will lose most coral reefs with the amount of climate change we'll have, but we need to keep the environment where those reefs were healthy, so that the next ecosystem will be in as good a state as it can be, and productive and clean and so on. Yeah.
Sure. Okay, many thanks.
Yeah, I can see you now.
Okay. David, thanks again for your talk today in CEBIMar. It's this space for the discuss science here in the USP. And see you in another opportunity, maybe, and talking again. People, thanks for your participation in this seminar, and see you on the next Thursday and the similar hour, and another people talk.
Yeah, thank you all. It's a pleasure, Juan Pablo. Thanks for inviting me. And if you have any comments or queries, or you want to apply the model as well and test it, we're trying to do that. So I'd love to share the methodology and approach and see what works and build up good examples. And of course, one thing we really welcome, try and encourage is collaboration between Brazil and Mozambique in particular, because of the Portuguese speaking, because Mozambique is a bit isolated here. So maybe we can all meet in Mozambique somewhere and look at a case study.